Quisi Bryan. On June 25, 2000, Cleveland police officer Wayne Leon, a 32-year-old husband and father, stopped a vehicle at a gas station on the west side of Cleveland, Ohio. The stop was as a result of the driver violating the traffic rule. The driver, Quisi Bryan, was a 29-year-old man with a troubled past. Officer Leon approached the vehicle with professionalism and calm. However, unknown to Leon, Bryan was desperate. Already under investigation for several prior crimes, Bryan carried a firearm and knew that a stop like this might expose him further. Without warning, Bryan drew his gun and shot Officer Leon in the face at point-blank range, killing him instantly. Kenneth Needhammer, the witness to the crime, gave his account of how he pursued Bryan's car, recounting that Bryan stopped his car on 2 occasions and shot at him. Eventually, Bryan crashed his car into some parked cars and fled on foot. Later that evening, he was arrested by police officers in Columbus, Ohio. He was charged with the murder of Officer Leon and the attempted murder of Kenneth Needhammer. He was convicted and sentenced to death. In 2007, Bryan pleaded guilty to multiple sexual assaults that occurred prior to the 2000 incident, receiving 48 additional years. He was later sentenced to 22 years. In 2014, Bryan was convicted of a 1990 kidnapping case after DNA evidence linked him to the crime. He was sentenced to a maximum of 50 years in prison for this offense. As of January 2025, Bryan has served approximately 24 years in prison, and he is currently 55 years old. His execution is scheduled for January 7, 2026. Antonio S. Franklin. On April 18, 1997, firefighters responded to a blaze at 39 Regal Street in Dayton, Ohio. Inside the charred residence, they discovered the lifeless bodies of 72-year-old Ivory Franklin Sr., his 70-year-old wife Ophelia, and their 52-year-old son, Anthony. All three had suffered severe blunt force trauma before the fire was set. The previous day, tensions had escalated within the Franklin household. 19-year-old Antonio S. Franklin, grandson to Ivory and Ophelia and nephew to Anthony, had been living with them. Frustrated by his unemployment and truancy, his grandparents had given him an ultimatum to find a new place to live. An argument ensued between Antonio and his uncle Anthony, during which Anthony allegedly accused Antonio of being gay. In a fit of rage, Antonio grabbed a baseball bat and brutally attacked his uncle. He then turned the weapon on his grandparents, striking them multiple times. To conceal his heinous acts, Antonio doused parts of the house with an accelerant and set it ablaze before fleeing the scene in his grandfather's car. Authorities quickly identified Antonio as the prime suspect. He was apprehended and, in 1998, convicted of the aggravated murders of his grandparents and uncle, as well as charges of aggravated arson and aggravated robbery. The jury recommended the death penalty, and Antonio was subsequently sentenced to death. As of January 2025, Antonio Franklin has been incarcerated for nearly 27 years. His execution is scheduled for February 11, 2026 by lethal injection. Currently, he is 47 years old. James E. Trimble. On January 21, 2005, 45-year-old James Earl Trimble committed a series of heinous crimes in Portage County, Ohio. That evening, following a domestic dispute, Trimble used an assault rifle to fatally shoot his live-in girlfriend, 42-year-old Renee Bauer, and her 7-year-old son, Dakota Bauer, in their home. Renee suffered multiple gunshot wounds, while young Dakota was shot 6 times. After these murders, Trimble fled the scene, eventually breaking into the nearby apartment of 22-year-old Kent State University student Sarah Positano. Holding her hostage overnight, Trimble ultimately shot and killed Sarah before law enforcement could intervene. Trimble was apprehended and subsequently convicted on multiple counts of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and related offenses. The jury recommended, and the judge imposed, 3 death sentences for the murders. At the time of his crimes, Trimble was 45 years old. As of January 2025, he is 65 years old and remains on death row, with his execution by lethal injection scheduled for March 12, 2026. Gerald R. Hand. On January 15, 2002, 52-year-old Gerald R. Hand, a white male, fatally shot his 58-year-old wife Jill Hand and his 55-year-old friend Walter Lonnie Welch at their home in Delaware County, Ohio. Hand initially claimed that an intruder had killed his wife and that he shot the intruder in self-defense, not realizing it was Welch. However, investigators uncovered evidence that Hand had conspired with Welch to murder Jill for life insurance money and had subsequently killed Welch to silence him. Further investigations revealed that Hand had previously hired Welch to kill his first 2 wives, Donna and Lori Hand, in the 1970s. Hand was convicted of the aggravated murders of Jill and Welch and was sentenced to death on June 4, 2003. At the time of the crimes, Hand was 52 years old. As of January 2025, he is 75 years old, and he was initially scheduled for execution on May 17, 2023, but now rescheduled for June 17, 2026 by lethal injection. Cleveland R. Jackson. Cleveland Ramon Jackson is a 48-year-old man convicted of the murder of 3-year-old Jalia Grant and 17-year-old Lenishia Williams during a robbery on January 3, 2002 in Lima, Ohio. On the day of the robbery, Cleveland Jackson and his half-brother, Jeronique Cunningham, decided to rob the apartment of Shane Lyles. Jackson lured Shane out of the apartment to discuss a drug transaction in the staircase of the apartment complex. His cousin stayed in the apartment watching television with 3 teenagers. Cunningham stood up and ordered the 3 teenagers into the kitchen. When the teenagers did not immediately comply, Cunningham stuck one of the teenagers in the jaw with a gun he had on him. Jackson then pointed a gun at Shane and ordered him into the apartment. After Jackson robbed Shane and his apartment of money and drugs, he forced Shane back into the kitchen where the 3 teenagers were located and demanded for more money. When Shane said he had no more money, Jackson shot Shane, and with that, his cousin joined him, and they opened fire on everyone in the kitchen, including the teenagers. They continued until they ran out of fire and fled the scene. Everyone in the kitchen were shot at least once. 2 were killed, Lenishia Williams and Jalia Grant. Jackson was indicted for both murders and for aggravated robbery and attempted aggravated murder as to the surviving shooting victims, and was sentenced to death. He has served 20 years of his life on Ohio's death row and currently scheduled for execution by lethal injection by July 15, 2026. Danny L. Hill. Danny L. Hill is a 58-year-old man currently on death row in Ohio. He was convicted of the 1985 murder of 12-year-old Raymond Fife in Warren, Ohio. At the time of the crime, Hill was 18 years old. On September 10, 1985, Raymond left home on his bike to visit a friend's house, but never arrived. His body was found in a wooded area the next day, severely beaten, assaulted, and traced of burnt. Investigators described the crime as particularly brutal, with evidence showing the boy was tortured before he died. Hill and his friend, Timothy Combs, were both implicated in the crime. Combs, who was 17 at the time, was sentenced to life in prison after being convicted of aggravated murder. Hill, tried separately, was convicted in 1986 of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and other charges, and was sentenced to death. Hill's execution has been delayed multiple times due to appeals. His attorneys argued that his intellectual disability should prevent him from being executed, a claim that has gone through several court rulings. Despite these legal challenges, his death sentence remains in place. As of 2025, Hill has spent nearly 39 years on Ohio's death row. His execution is scheduled for July 22, 2026, by lethal injection. Jerome Henderson. Jerome Henderson is an African-American man currently on death row in Ohio. In 1985, at the age of 26, he was convicted of the murder of his neighbor, 26-year-old Mary Akoff in Cincinnati, Ohio. On March 3, 1985, Henderson broke into Mary's apartment, attempted to force himself on her, and inflicted multiple stab wounds, leading to her death. Henderson was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, and attempted assault. In August 1985, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. Over the years, Henderson has pursued various appeals challenging his conviction and sentence. Despite these efforts, his death sentence has been upheld. As of January 2025, Henderson is 67 years old and has spent nearly 40 years on death row. His execution has been rescheduled multiple times, with the current date set for October 21, 2026. Melvin D. Bonnell Jr. Melvin D. Bonnell Jr. is a 67-year-old white male currently on death row in Ohio. In 1987, at the age of 30, he was convicted of the murder of 23-year-old Robert Bunner in Cleveland, Ohio. On November 28, 1986, Bonnell entered Bunner's apartment and shot him twice, resulting in Bunner's death. Bonnell was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, and related offenses. In 1988, he was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. Over the years, Bonnell has filed multiple appeals and motions for post-conviction relief, including requests for DNA testing and claims of prosecutorial misconduct. Despite these efforts, his conviction and death sentence have been upheld. As of January 2025, Bonnell has spent over 36 years on death row. His execution has been rescheduled multiple times, with the current date set for November 18, 2026. Timothy L. Hoffner. Timothy L. Hoffner is a 55-year-old male currently on death row in Ohio. On September 22, 1993, at the age of 20, Hoffner, along with his accomplice Archie J. Dixon, lured their 22-year-old roommate, Christopher Hammer, to a location in Toledo, Ohio. They attacked Hammer, tied him up, and put him alive in a shallow grave in a wooded area. The motive was to steal Hammer's car and sell it for profit. Hoffner was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death in 1996. As of January 2025, he has been on death row for over 28 years. His execution has been rescheduled multiple times, with the current date set for July 14, 2027. John D. Stumpf. John D. Stumpf is a 66-year-old white male currently on death row in Ohio. On May 14, 1984, at the age of 23, Stumpf, along with accomplices Clyde Daniel Wesley and Norman Leroy Edmonds, committed a robbery and double shooting in New Concord, Ohio. They targeted the home of Norman Stout, a Korean War Air Force veteran, and his wife Mary Jane Stout, a mother of 3. After forcing their way into the Stout's residence, Stumpf and Wesley held the couple at gunpoint. During the altercation, Norman was shot multiple times but survived, while Mary Jane was fatally shot. The assailants fled the scene, stealing the Stout's vehicle. Stumpf was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, aggravated robbery, grand theft auto, and firearm theft. He was convicted and sentenced to death on September 24, 1984. As of January 2025, he has been on death row for over 40 years. His execution has been rescheduled multiple times, with the current date set for August 18, 2027, by lethal injection. Lawrence A. Landrum. Lawrence A. Landrum is a 67-year-old male currently on death row in Ohio. On September 19, 1985, at the age of 34, Landrum committed the murder of 84-year-old Harold White near Chillicothe, Ohio. Landrum had previously expressed intentions to rob Harold, stating he was in financial trouble and might rob Harold to obtain money. On the day of the murder, Landrum entered Harold's apartment under the pretense of inquiring about a rental. After a brief conversation, Landrum left but returned later that evening. Upon his return, he found Harold at home and confronted him, stating, "I'm going to get all the money and stuff I can." Harold attempted to call the police, but before he could, Landrum's 14-year-old accomplice, Grant Swackhammer, struck Harold on the head multiple times with a large railroad bolt. Landrum and Swackhammer continued to assault Harold, and during the attack, Harold's throat was hurt severely. After the murder, Landrum threatened to use the knife on anyone who went to the police. He was arrested on September 21, 1985, and later convicted of aggravated murder. Landrum was sentenced to death in February 1986. As of January 2025, he has been on death row for over 38 years. His execution was originally scheduled for October 15, 2024, but was rescheduled to October 13, 2027, by lethal injection. Warren K. Henness. Warren K. Henness is a 64-year-old male currently on death row in Ohio. On March 20, 1992, at the age of 31, Henness, a drug addict, was assisted by his wife Tabitha in the robbery and murder of 51-year-old Richard Myers, a laboratory technician in Columbus, Ohio. Richard had been helping Henness with his addiction issue. On the morning of the crime, Richard picked up Henness from his residence, and later, Henness returned to pick up Tabitha in Richard's vehicle. Richard was reported missing that afternoon and never reported to work that night. Henness was found in possession of Richard's credit cards and checkbook. The couple used these items to purchase drugs and merchandise. Richard's body was discovered on March 25, 1992, in an abandoned water purification plant, showing signs of severe trauma. Henness was arrested and later convicted of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to death in 1993. As of January 2025, he has been on death row for over 31 years. His execution was originally scheduled for December 17, 2024, but was rescheduled to December 15, 2027 by lethal injection. Keith LaMar. Keith LaMar, also known as Bomani Shakur, is a 55-year-old African-American man currently on death row in Ohio. In 1995, at the age of 26, he was convicted for his involvement in the deaths of 5 inmates during the 1993 Lucasville prison uprising at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. On April 11, 1993, a riot erupted at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, lasting for 11 days and resulting in the deaths of 1 corrections officer and 9 inmates. The uprising was marked by severe overcrowding and tensions within the facility. In 1995, LaMar was convicted of aggravated murder for the deaths of 5 inmates during the riot. He was subsequently sentenced to death. Prior to these events, in 1989, he was convicted of murder following a fatal shooting during a robbery attempt in Cleveland, Ohio. He was 19 years old at that time and was sentenced to 18 years to life in prison. As of January 2025, he has spent nearly 30 years on death row. His execution is scheduled for January 13, 2027. Scott A. Group is a 62-year-old white male currently on death row in Ohio. On January 18, 1997, at the age of 31, Group committed a fatal shooting during a robbery at the downtown bar in Youngstown, Ohio. The victim was 56-year-old Robert Lozier, the husband of the bar's owner, Sandra Lozier. Group was employed as a delivery man for Ohio Wine Imports Company, had been making regular deliveries to the downtown bar. On the day of the crime, he shot Robert Lozier to death during a robbery. Following his arrest, Group was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. He has been on death row since the late 1990s. Over the years, Group has filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. His execution date has been rescheduled multiple times, with the current date set for February 17, 2027. Gregory Lott. Gregory Lott is a 63-year-old black male currently on death row in Ohio. On July 12, 1986, at the age of 25, Lott committed a robbery that led to the death of 82-year-old John McGrath in East Cleveland, Ohio. Lott broke into McGrath's home, tied him up, doused him with heating lamp oil, and set him on fire. McGrath was found alive but severely injured on July 15, 1986, and he later died due to his injuries shortly thereafter. Lott was arrested, convicted of aggravated murder, and sentenced to death in 1987. He has been on death row for over 37 years. His execution has been rescheduled multiple times, with the current date set for April 14, 2027. John Stojetz. John C. Stojetz is a 71-year-old white male currently on death row in Ohio. On April 25, 1996, at the age of 40, Stojetz, along with several accomplices, fatally used a knife on 17-year-old Damico Watkins, a black inmate, at the Madison Correctional Institution in London, Ohio. At the time, Stojetz was serving a sentence for a prior offense and was a leader of a white supremacist prison gang. Stojetz was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death in 1997. As of January 2025, he has been on death row for over 27 years. His execution has been rescheduled multiple times, with the current date set for May 19, 2027. Archie J. Dixon. Archie J. Dixon is a 51-year-old white male currently on death row in Ohio. On September 21, 1993, at the age of 20, Dixon and his accomplice, Timothy Hoffner, lured their 22-year-old roommate, Christopher Hammer, to a location in Toledo, Ohio. They attacked Hammer, tied him up, and put him alive in a shallow grave in a wooded area. The motive was to steal Hammer's car and sell it for profit. Dixon was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death in 1996. As of January 2025, he has been on death row for over 28 years. His execution has been rescheduled multiple times, with the current date set for June 16, 2027. Stanley T. Adams. Stanley T. Adams is a 61-year-old male currently on death row in Ohio, convicted of the brutal murders of Esther Cook and her 12-year-old daughter, Ashley Cook, on October 11, 1999, when he was 38 years old. Stanley had been living with the Cook family for several months before the tragedy struck. On the day of the murders, Adams spent the evening partying and using drugs with the Cooks. Later that night, in a drug-induced rage, he fatally used a knife on Esther and Ashley in their home in Warren, Ohio. The crime was a horrific act that left the mother and daughter dead. After the murders, Adams fled the scene, but police arrested him shortly afterward, and he was convicted of aggravated murder. He was sentenced to death in 2001 for his crimes. Since then, Adams has been on death row in Ohio, serving more than 23 years. Adams was initially scheduled for execution on February 16, 2022, but his execution was delayed due to issues with obtaining the drugs needed for the lethal injection. His execution is now set for February 16, 2028. As of January 2025, Adams is 61 years old and remains on Ohio's death row, awaiting the execution that has been scheduled multiple times. James G. Hanna. James G. Hanna is a 78-year-old male currently on death row in Ohio. On August 16, 1997, at the age of 47, Hanna committed the murder of his 43-year-old cellmate, Peter Kopas, at the Lebanon Correctional Institution in Lebanon, Ohio. Hanna and Kopas had a contentious relationship, marked by disputes over cell conditions and personal property. On the night of the murder, an altercation escalated, leading Hanna to fatally use the knife on Kopas. Hanna was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death in 1998. As of January 2025, Hanna has been incarcerated for over 27 years. His execution was initially scheduled for May 14, 2025, but was postponed due to ongoing issues with obtaining lethal injection drugs. Governor Mike DeWine issued a fourth reprieve for Hanna, rescheduling his execution to April 19, 2028. Thank you for watching, guys. Which of these individuals do you think deserves a death punishment? Comment below.